Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about hearing and balance. Both of these are detected by the ear. Right? So the ear does house our sense of hearing and balance. Balance is also called equilibrium. So let's take a closer look at the structures of the ear. So we can divide the ear into three parts. The external ear, which is mostly just for getting sound into the ear. The middle ear, which is mostly for conducting vibrations to the inner ear and also for equilibrating pressure. And then the inner ear, which is where we actually detect sound and balance. So the external ear, we're not going to talk a lot about in this video, but basically it's composed of a structure called the auricle or the pinna, which is like a funnel that's funneling sound into a tube called your auditory canal. The auditory canal is going to be just a space for sound vibrations to travel through until it hits something called the tympanic membrane or the eardrum. So the tympanic membrane is the border between the outer ear and the middle ear. Sound vibrations that cause the tympanic membrane to vibrate are transmitted to the auditory ossicles. Auditory ossicles are actually the smallest bones in your body, and they're called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And as these vibrate, they will transmit these vibrations to a fluid inside your inner ear in a structure called the cochlea. Also in the middle ear, we have the auditory tube, which is a tube that leads from the middle ear to your pharynx or throat. And this is important for allowing the equilibration of pressure. These vibrations that enter into the ear need to leave the ear, and they leave through the auditory tube. The auditory tube is also known as the eustachian tube or the pharyngotympanic tube. Now, the middle ear, because it's connected to your throat, is very easily susceptible to infection. So your pharynx or your throat contains a lot of bacteria. And that bacteria can travel up the eustachian tube into the middle ear. Now, children are at a higher risk for otitis media or an middle ear infection, and this is because they have an underdeveloped immune system, so it's harder for them to fight infections, but also because that eustachian tube is really short, and so it's a very short distance for the bacteria to travel from the pharynx to the middle ear. Sometimes otitis media results in lots of fluid buildup in the middle ear, and so in order to prevent the tympanic membrane from rupturing, sometimes tubes will be placed in the tympanic membrane to allow the fluid to drain out. Now, the inner ear is going to be the structure that actually detects the sound vibrations and detects balance. So let's take a closer look at how we're going to use the inner ear for hearing. So the cochlea is the part of the inner ear that is responsible for detecting sound, and it's the part that looks like the spiral shape of a snail's shell. Now, if we were to look inside the cochlea, we would see that it contains three chambers: an upper chamber called the scala vestibuli, a middle chamber called the cochlear duct, and a lower chamber called the scala tympani. And there's fluid inside of all of these chambers. The scala vestibuli and the scala tympani contain a fluid called perilymph, and the cochlear duct contains a fluid called endolymph. And these two fluids are different in their composition, and they're different from other body fluids too. Like, for example, endolymph contains a high amount of potassium. Normally potassium isn't found in a high concentration in an extracellular fluid, but it is in the endolymph. The main organ for hearing is actually found in the cochlear duct, and the organ for hearing is called the organ of Corti. So in this picture here, we can see we've taken a section through the cochlea, and we can see those three chambers: the scala vestibuli, the cochlear duct, and the scala tympani. If you look closely at the cochlear duct, you can see a strange structure inside of there, and that is the organ of Corti. So the organ of Corti contains the cells that are capable of responding to vibrations that are entering into the ear. And these are a type of hair cell, and they are also a type of mechanoreceptor. So the hair cell just tells us that they have hair-like projections on them. Mechanoreceptor tells us that they can respond to movement. So these hair cells are embedded in the organ of Corti. Below them, we find a membrane called the basilar membrane, and above them, we find a membrane called the tectorial membrane. So the basilar membrane is the base of the organ of Corti that the hair cells sit on, whereas the tectorial membrane is sort of the roof here, and the hairs on the hair cells are touching the tectorial membrane. Okay? Now let's take a look at how we can use the organ of Corti to hear. So what's going to happen is sound vibrations are going to enter into the cochlea, okay, and as the sound vibrations enter into the cochlea, they're basically now vibrating fluid inside the cochlea. And so eventually that fluid vibration is going to cause the basilar membrane to vibrate. And when the basilar membrane vibrates, those hairs are going to bend, because if the basilar membrane vibrates, the hair cells will be pushed up against the tectorial membrane, and the hairs will bend because they're already touching a ceiling, right? And this is going to cause the opening of mechanically gated ion channels in the hair cells. This causes the hair cells to experience a receptor potential, and then the hair cells release neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is then picked up by a nearby sensory neuron, and now that sensory neuron itself experiences an action potential, and now we're sending a signal along the cochlear nerve towards the brain. So in this picture, we can see the cochlea, but it's been straightened out. Normally it's in that spiral shape. We've straightened it out, right? And we can see how the tympanic membrane is causing the auditory ossicles to vibrate. And then we can see how, as the stapes vibrates, it's pushing on the fluid in the scala vestibuli, that upper chamber of the cochlea. And eventually that vibration goes down through the cochlear duct and into the scala tympani, causing the basilar membrane to vibrate. So that middle line there inside the cochlea, that's representing our basilar membrane. You can see how it's very clearly vibrating. So the little star is going to trace the path of the vibration for us. So you notice that the vibration entered through something called the oval window, which is behind the footplate of the stapes. And then the vibration traveled through the fluid of the scala vestibuli, through the cochlear duct, causing the basilar membrane to vibrate, and then the vibration has to leave the cochlea or else it will explode, and the vibration leaves through the fluid of the scala tympani, and then it exits through a round window, which is a membrane between the cochlea and the middle ear. So now we're going to trace the path of sound vibrations through the ear, right? So we've done it in little bits and pieces throughout this lecture, but now we'll put it all together in a big picture. So sound waves travel from the auricle to the auditory canal, and then they vibrate the tympanic membrane. And this is going to cause the auditory ossicles, which are those tiny bones, to vibrate. Don't forget these tiny bones include the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Behind the stapes is a window called the oval window. And the oval window leads to the scala vestibuli of the cochlea. So the oval window vibrates when the stapes vibrates. Those vibrations travel through the perilymph of the scala vestibuli. The vibration usually doesn't make it to the end of the cochlea. It usually shortcuts through the cochlear duct. It depends upon the type of vibration, how far it gets through the cochlea. Now the basilar membrane vibrates, and this pushes the hairs on the hair cells of the organ of Corti up against that tectorial membrane, right? So the hairs are bent, right? And then this is going to lead to a signal being sent along the cochlear nerve. Note that vibrations do not travel along the cochlear nerve. A nerve is a bundle of axons. Axons carry electrical signals, so the vibration itself does not transmit through the cochlear nerve. The vibrations do have to leave the cochlea, though, or else the cochlea will explode. The vibrations are going to move to the perilymph of the scala tympani, where the vibrations will then begin to travel back towards the middle ear. The vibrations will then hit the round window, and on the other side of the round window is going to be a space leading to the auditory tube, or the eustachian tube, if you will. Now the vibrations are going to enter into the air of the auditory tube, where they will travel through the pharynx, relieving any pressure in the ear. Let's take a look at how a cochlear implant works. So cochlear implants are used by individuals that suffer from sensorineural deafness, which is deafness due to cochlea damage or nerve damage. And this is a little bit different than conductive deafness, which is deafness that's caused by outer or middle ear damage. So a cochlear implant has both an external component and an internal component. So the external component receives sound from the outside environment, processes it, and then sends a small electric current near the cochlear nerve. That's the internal component then. These electrical currents activate the nerve, which then sends a signal to the brain. The cochlear implant only somewhat simulates natural hearing, but it's not exactly what we would call normal hearing. Now let's take a look at our sense of balance. Right? Our sense of balance is also known as our sense of equilibrium, and it is largely a subconscious sense. So almost all of our special senses we're very aware of, but this one much less so. Okay? But like hearing, it does involve the inner ear. The sense of balance is detected through two structures in the inner ear, the vestibule and the semicircular canals. So these two structures allow us to detect what we call static equilibrium, linear motion, and angular motion. And all of these three things combined is what allows you to sense balance. So the vestibule of the inner ear is for detecting static equilibrium, which you can think of like gravity sense, right? You can tell that you're not upside down right now, and that's because of your static equilibrium sense. It also detects linear motion, which is straight line motion. The semicircular canals, on the other hand, are for detecting angular motion. So this is motion that's not in a straight line, so turning, for example. So let's first take a closer look at how the vestibule works. So as I said, the vestibule is for detecting static equilibrium and linear motion. The vestibule contains hair cells, just like we saw with hearing. So it has clusters of hair cells, and they have hairs on them, stereocilia. The hair cells are embedded in a substance called otolith. So otolith is basically a gel-like substance with a lot of rocks in it. Now, when you move your head with respect to gravity, the gravity is going to pull on the stones of the otolith. Right? So in the picture here, we can see the man standing with his head upright. Right? You can see the hairs of the hair cells embedded in the otolith. Right? But when he tilts his head forward, you notice that the force of gravity is pulling on the stones in the otolith. And because the hairs of the hair cells are embedded in the membrane of the otolith, as the stones are pulled, the hairs are bent too. And this causes mechanically gated ion channels to open on the hair cells. The hair cells then experience a receptor potential, and they release neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter is then picked up by a nearby sensory neuron, and a signal is sent along the vestibular nerve towards the brain, where you will detect your equilibrium sense, in this case, your static equilibrium. And even though this information is sent towards the brain, you are not usually overly aware or perceive this particular sense. Most of it happens at the subconscious level. The vestibule allows us to detect our static equilibrium, our gravity sense, if you will. So our ability to tell where our head is in position to gravity. And the vestibule also allows us to detect linear motion, which is straight line motion. Like when you're driving in a car straight down 94, right, you can tell that you're moving. You're not moving at an angle, but you're moving in a straight line. That's linear motion sense. The semicircular canals are different. They allow you to detect angular motion. So if you were driving straight and then turned, your turning is what would be detected by the semicircular canals. So we have 3 semicircular canals per ear, and each is located at a different angle to the other, right? And by having these canals at differing positions, it allows us to detect angular motion in any direction. So the semicircular canals are actually attached to the vestibule. And where the semicircular canals attach to the vestibule, there's like a swollen area, and this is called an ampulla. And within the ampulla, we have hair cells, right? And the hair cells have hairs that are embedded in a gel-like structure called a cupula. So this is very similar to what we saw with otolith, but the difference is there are no rocks here. So we have hairs embedded in a gel-like substance. Now, the way the semicircular canals work is that whenever you move at an angle, there's a fluid in the semicircular canals that are going to move. And that fluid is going to hit the cupula and cause the cupula to sway, right? And when the cupula bends, the hairs in the cupula will bend. And when those hairs bend, that is going to open mechanically gated ion channels. That's going to cause the hair cell to experience a receptor potential, which will lead to the release of neurotransmitter by the hair cell. The neurotransmitter is then picked up by a nearby sensory neuron, and now a signal will be sent along the vestibular nerve towards the brain, where you will eventually be able to sense balance. And again, even though this information is sent to your brain, most of it is occurring at the subconscious level, so you're not really consciously perceiving all of this information coming in from your semicircular canals and your vestibule.